Hey, welcome to the City Rev Life podcast. My name is Robey. This is Rebekah, and we are in a series about Encanto.
Yep.
We're talking about the movie Encanto and looking at it from a couple different perspectives. And in this episode, we're talking about the family dynamics that are displayed in Encanto, what we can learn about them, and kind of just booting off of that movie. What does that mean, and how does it make us think differently about our family dynamics? What can we learn? And some really interesting things in here, and specifically the powers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they didn't give like traditional powers like one person's can fly, one person's invisibility, but they gave powers that remind us of particular people,
yes.
maybe in a family system,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So like there's a scapegoat in Maribel. We talked about that in a previous episode.
Mm-hmm.
There's the black sheep in Bruno, right?
Yep.
There's the person that can change
Shapeshift.
It can shapeshift.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. And, but there's someone that can change the temperature of the room simply by what mood they're in.
Yep.
And then there's a person that takes so much of the strength on themselves.
Yep.
There's the person that is kind of feeds the whole family, and that food, brings the family together.
Right,
and there's healing.
And healing with that, right.
Yeah.
The perfectionist that perfectionist personality, wanting everything to be just so.
Yeah. And it's kind of viewed as the one that got all the good grades or was the best athlete or whatever. And
perfect hair.
And the perfect hair. There's one in every family. Anyway, but specifically the big kind of question that in some ways is left unanswered is Maribel's. What is her power?
Right.
And the opening song keeps asking, what's your power? What's your power? What about Maribel? What about Maribel? And keeps asking that question, and they never totally answer that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's provocative because there is something that she gives back to the whole family.
Right. Well, I mean, they make the case that she never got one. That's the underlying thing with Maribel. No, she didn't get one, and that's what she's known for. Yeah. And so but I think the movie really sets up that she did get an amazing gift. And at the end, the abuela kind of says, they gave me you. I was praying for help, asking Pedro for help, and he gifted me you. And so there is a really special power that she brings, but it's just not as celebrated or isn't as
miraculous.
Yeah, miraculous maybe.
And I think what is interesting is she actually is leveraging a real life power that many of our families need. And that if we kind of push into this a little bit, it may be a power you can unleash in your family dynamics that can bring real healing to your family, maybe your nuclear family or extended family. And even something that can maybe be trained into children. And so, but let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it's you bring up a good point. The role of storytelling is essentially kind of what she ends up doing, because she goes to every member of her family and she kind of makes amends with some of them, but hears their story.
Right.
She really hears her story and gets it out of them and understands and is that safe person listening ear. And you could argue because she doesn't have a power, she doesn't have anything to lose. And so therapeutically, there's a lot out there in research that really affirms the power of a story and helping what I call as our little T traumas. There's big T traumas, which is the ideas of, being a post-traumatic stress disorder, kind of like in war or a natural disaster. We consider those to be like our big T traumas. And there's lots out there to aid people who've been through such traumatic events. But for many of our listeners and for us, we haven't necessarily gone through those type of big T traumas, but there are little T traumas. There's the things in our past or our family history or a loss at a young age that we've had to endure. And not to minimize and say that that's less significant than someone who's weathered war or a natural disaster, but those little T traumas are a lot more relationship based as opposed to like a disaster.
Yeah, and sometimes we overlook them. We're like, oh, well, it's not like, I lost a limb when I was little,
Right.
and so sometimes we don't realize the effect that those what we would think are smaller things have on us.
Right. But they're a big deal. And so the Dr. Henry Cloud really coined this well for me. And he talks about the power of the other. And we see this play out with Maribel and her abuela. Really Maribel and a lot of the characters, but at the end, when we see the dance between the two kind of unfold, we see how the power of the others really starts to empower each other's stories. So Dr. Henry Cloud talks about how when you share a story, you are essentially rewiring not only your brain, but the listener's brain. You rewire each other's brains for one another. And telling a traumatic story, it's kind of like bringing a file out of the filing cabinet, kind of brushing it off, rereading it, and then restoring it again. And why is that important? Because a lot of times our traumatic memories are in the back part of our brain, our unconscious part of our brain. And so our brains are constantly fielding information, taking in cues about our environment all the time that we're not even aware of. We just are regularly just doing it. And the back part of our brain, the unconscious part, as well as the front part, are constantly taking inventory of lots of different cues simultaneously without us even realizing it. So a lot of times when we've got a memory that needs to kind of be told and shared and almost restored, the process of storytelling helps us doing that. So in like post-traumatic stress disordered clients, a lot of times they will see a therapist because they have something called like reoccurring nightmares. And the psychology of what's happening on a much simpler scale, if I can just summarize it quickly, it's like your memories that you've had that are in the unconscious part of your brain are trying to get refiled. And every time they're trying to get refiled, they're going into the front part of your brain looking for analysis. And what's happening is the front part of your brain is your conscious part. So eventually you wake up a lot of times in the middle of the night with these traumatic events replaying in your brain. Well, that's your brain trying to refile and refile and refile what's so traumatic into something that feels less traumatic, so that when it's remembered, it doesn't have the same emotion and the same paralysis that it might have on you on any given day. So similar to that, when you share a story of a traumatic event, like we see with Abuela, she is refiling it kind of, and you see Maribel's face kind of take inventory of those cues and understanding and seeing, wow, this is a big deal to Grandma's story. It's really traumatic, and she kind of affirms that in the end. She says, I understand now, I see.
Right.
And that's a big deal. So the cool thing, what's happening on a kind of face-to-face level is there's kind of two conversations that are happening simultaneously when we share our stories with another person. One is just the verbal communication, the questions that provoke curiosity, the actual putting language, using your left side of your brain to put language to the right side of your brain, memories and emotion, and that helps organize our experiences. And that also can't be accomplished by reading a text or even listening to a text. It has to be like a verbal communication, so a back and forth. But there's another conversation that's happening on a brain level. Your nonverbals can provide just an unspoken validation or an unspoken empathy, and you see that playing out a little bit with Maribel and her abuela, just watching the story unfold and seeing that. And in doing so, they both are creating a new neural pathway, a new way of looking at an event or a memory through a completely different lens. And so if you've ever had an experience where you've had something traumatic happen, but over time, if you've worked through it, you can recall that memory without the same negative emotions anymore. And you kind of get the sense at the end of the movie that they put their family back together and they're able to build on what they say, a new foundation.
Sure.
It isn't perfect, and neither are we, but they're building on that new foundation.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that the healing for the abuela and also for the family, it really boils down to that moment is this series. And really it's kind of building. It starts with Maribel and is it Luisa? Is she the strong one? Yeah. Right. So Maribel and Luisa, and they hug it out,
Yep.
And then they have she has that moment with her, Isabel, her other sister, who's the perfect one. And then they hug it out as well. And then with Abuela. And once again, really the healing pattern is Maribel sits with each one of them, hears their story, lets them share vulnerably, and each one of them ultimately to this culminating moment where there's a trauma that was what started kind of this whole family system, and hearing that out. And it's really for the abuela, just someone hearing her story and then showing just kind of some affirming, validating, empathetic statements. It's kind of, that's the healing for that family.
Right. Absolutely. And so it's cool to see in a very fun way that the movie shows and portrays the power of sharing your story.
Yeah.
So it's neat to see the research catching up and affirming what we can see playing out in healthy relationships.
Yeah. And honestly, it's instructive. And this is a great thing, and not necessarily a bad thing I think a good thing to highlight if you're watching it with your family, with your kids, highlight it with your kids. Oh, look, they shared openly, they shared vulnerably, and show them that dynamic. But I think that's a really good takeaway as far as understanding family dynamics. One of the most powerful things we can do within our families, and starting with the most nuclear within marriages, then with our children, then working out with siblings and other family members, one of the most powerful things we can do is to listen. That is, we so often in our culture see listening as just either something I have to do to be polite, or it's something I do waiting for my opportunity to get in and fix the problem. Well, listening really well and really thoroughly, and listening in a way that can validate and empathize on the other end, sometimes that is the fix. Like sometimes that is the healing that's needed. It's not the 10-step process that I'm coming up with in my mind while the other person's talking. It's just the power of listening, and can be such a powerful agent within that family structure. And Encanto shows that in such a beautiful way. Right.
And I think too, being a listener, especially if you've been, Maribel is kind of a victim a little bit of the abuela's story kind of fleshing its way out. And you don't see them going back and forth. You see her just genuinely listening. And I think as believers, we need to take a page out of Christ's story to be able to get into that position of listening vulnerably and honestly, even if we're a part of that person's story. Because a lot of times in families, we are, we're not independent of our families. We're a lot of times involved in the storyline. But to be able to take a position of just listening, even if it plays out with me in it, I think we have to borrow a page of the gospel and being able to just sit and listen and say, I know how this story will end because God ends through Christ, brings resurrection and healing to all things. Right. And so in that moment, I can sit and listen to maybe the traumatic, the uncomfortable. We don't really like to sit in that, but by really making the gospel our first and foremost story, we can sit in those moments and not feel the need to put in our input in our agenda.
Yeah. And Maribel, to your point, Maribel, she goes to each of these characters, and especially Isabel, the perfect sister, and the abuela, they both have hurt Maribel, but she has to absorb that in the moment to be able to empathize and be vulnerable with them. And hopefully she, later on in the story that we didn't see in the movie, got her chance to honestly express herself back to them. But there is something powerful where those wounds get put on the shelf to be able to enter into someone else's story. And that's a self-sacrificing position. And so I think the takeaway is remembering the power of listening. And let's just start very small. In marriage, it's one of maybe the most important tools we have with each other, is just being a witness to each other's lives, to just listen, to just share and be a partner with the victories, with the losses, with the pains, with the traumas, some of which we've caused on each other. And so being willing to listen, to take lots of time to just listen, and having that dimension within marriage, getting good at listening, within marriage is so critical for the family dynamic. A lot of times communication in marriage can just get whittled down to, where the kids need to be and what homework needs to be done, but sitting down and spending time listening and sharing into that. With kids, sometimes the things that they're talking about, they seem so inconsequential, right? It's a story that takes about 4 times too long to tell about what happened on the playground that, you weren't really interested in the beginning to begin with. But stopping and realizing, hey, this is a very significant thing. And I want to build a culture within the family that my kids know that that if this is important to them, they can come share it with me. Because if I don't build that early, that culture of listening early, then one day there's going to be something I do want them to talk to me about, but they've got no history of me listening. And so really listening to those things, that silly moment on the playground that may not seem like a big deal, that might be a small trauma that needs to be listened to and worked through. Extended family, a sibling, an aunt, uncle, a parent, depending on your family, deploying that gift that could be a miraculous healing agent that God could use in your family, of listening to each other's stories and applying empathy and validation. It could be something that's very powerful within our families.
It is. It truly is a miraculous work when we can transform and rewire each other's brains through the simple act of just entering into each other's stories and listening. It's a beautiful power. It needs its own song, I think.
Yes. And in just a moment, we're going to break out into our own song, but look, we're out of time. Okay. So we can't, you'll have to join us another time for that. Anyway, we hope you're enjoying our series on Encanto, and thank you for joining us on this episode. We will see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on City Rev Life. You can subscribe to this podcast, rate and review wherever you're listening to this. And we love it when you share it with your friends on social media. For more videos and content, go ahead and check us out at cityrev.org/podcast or download our City Rev Church app. Have a great day.